This might come up as a surprise to many of you, but English is not my first language. Welcome to The Big Puzzle. In this podcast, we explore the subtle connections between science, religion, politics, economics, and history. One piece at a time, we unveil the big picture of this shared experience that we call life. So today we're going to be talking about language. Language is a very important piece of the big puzzle. It connects so many different things, and it's one of those pieces that is often overlooked because it's pervasive, right? We're always communicating and we don't think about language that often. But let's start with, what is language? And usually we can start by looking at the etymology of the words. And in the case of language, language comes from the Latin lingua. And lingua means tongue. So language is connected, is a way to communicate through sound. And that sound, even the early Romans understood in the importance of our tongue. You know, when they wanted to punish somebody, they wanted somebody to keep a secret or not being able to plot against the government or whatever, they would cut the tongue. So that would prevent them from easy interaction, easy communication. But, it's interesting. Not just the tongue, obviously. There's all the cavities, there's the vibrations, the membrane, that produce the sound and everything. And we can start maybe talking about that. We all have a main language, what we call our primary language, or first language, or mother language, mother tongue. And that's the one that we're more comfortable in. It's probably the one that we learn first, since we were babies. Later in life, with a lot of effort, we can learn other languages, but we're going to be talking a little more about that. One of the issues, again, talking about the tongue, is that your whole head develops around the sounds that you produce. No matter how much I try, I still have an accent. And it's not going anywhere. I really try. I try not to have an accent, but I do. And that's because my muscles and my tongue, my everything is prepared for producing other sounds. My lips, everything, my cheeks, all is prepared to speak another language in which I don't have any accents. And I can speak perfectly well. So, obviously, my first language is Spanish, in particular Argentinian Spanish, that we call Castellano, because it comes from Castilla, and it's kind of a peculiar pronunciation, similar in some senses with other Latin American countries, but quite different. And since we had a lot of immigration from Italy, some people say that Argentinians, and probably Uruguayans as well, we speak Spanish with Italian accent, and that makes perfect sense. It's a very peculiar accent. But we have some issues when we try to speak in other languages. So let's talk a little about these physiological issues that we have. The sounds that we cannot produce. So, for instance, we have, two different letters. There is the B and the V, right? And even in Spanish, and probably in places in Spain, they make that difference. They make that different sound for B and for V. But in Argentina and many Latin American countries, we don't. We just use the B for everything. We say vamos. So let's go vamos. We don't say vamos, even though the correct pronunciation would be vamos, we would say vamos. So we only use the B instead of the V. So when we come to English-speaking countries, where the V is very distinctive, it's so strong that even sounds more like an F, right, than a V. So we struggle because we're not ready to produce that sound. It doesn't come naturally, and we end up using the B, and then what we're saying doesn't. What we say is very, right? It's very, it's very. And it is difficult for us, especially when we're reading and we get to the V, and then, we just, our brain automatically pronounces the B, like we always do. The other one that we struggle with, and I don't want to generalize, I definitely do, and I believe that other people do as well, are all this variation of, again, one single sound. So we have the sh, right? Caballo. That it's even funny because other countries, they would pronounce it caballo or caballo, but we say caballo. So that's why we use the Y sound for the double L. That's very peculiar. Not in the whole country, but in the Rio de la Plata region, at least we pronounce it that way. It makes it very distinctive. At church, when we're singing hymns, whenever we get to one of those double L's, you can easily tell who is singing, who of the singers is from Argentina or Uruguay, and the rest. But in English we kind of have that sound, but it sounds slightly different. So we would use the same sound for SH, for G, for J, and even there's a lot overlap with ch, with ch, right? When I first came here and I say the Jordan River, and people say, well, what is that? The Jordan River? No, it's the Jordan River. It's more like ch than the actual sh that we pronounce. The other one that I always struggle with is when people, I like to watch documentaries about World War II, and people talk about the Sherman tanks. And for me, Sherman and German are the same word. So the Sherman tanks are not German tanks. And that's confusing. So I have to put extra effort to differentiate those different sounds. It's not as bad even, so for a while I also studied Chinese Mandarin, and they take that to the extreme. They have so many different sounds for that letter. So so all of those are variations of the same one, and I could never master them. I can say things like, 我说中文. I don't know how that really sounds, but I have to put a lot of effort to make those sounds different. For me, it's all sh. Another one that we struggle with is we don't have the th, that th. In region in Spain, they do use it, and we could even say the abuse of that th, that it sounds more like a D than an S, but for us, we always use this S sound. So one particular word that I always struggle with when I have to pronounce is something, because I have the two sounds. I have the S and the th, the s and th in the same word, and my brain has to be very focused to make the change. Usually, when I'm trying to say something fast, I would say something or something, or worse, I would say something, like my thumb is singing, right? So it is one other that we struggle with, because we don't use that sound, and it's difficult to summon it when we need it in English. And the last one I will mention is the Z, the Z. We don't use the Z at all, even though technically the Z sounds like th, zorro, let's say in Spain, but in Latin American Argentina we say zorro, like the S sound. Now, we can produce those sounds. I mean, you can teach yourself how to pronounce those sounds. I hope that I made them clear enough for you to know what I'm talking about, but it doesn't sound natural. But it's not just our problem. So you can really tell when somebody, that Spanish is not their first tongue and they try to roll their R's. And they can do it, and some people teach themselves to do, but it never sounds natural. So we would say correr, but if somebody, who learns Spanish later, they would say correr, correr. They would overroll the R's, and they can't avoid it. And I do fully understand that. That is a sound that you have to force. It doesn't come naturally to you. So that is a kind of a physiological issue of learning a new language. But we're going to be talking about several things, and I hope that at the end we can connect some interesting stuff. So, as always, bear with me. I hope that you learn something, and if maybe it will help you understand better. If you speak a second language, it will help you understand better. If you don't, it will make you develop some empathy for the people who are struggling to do these things. But the second issue that I always have in English has to do with the gender and number. And I don't know if that's how you said it in English. By number, I mean plural or singular, right? In Spanish and many other languages, words have gender. So they're feminine or masculine words. That doesn't mean that the object has gender. And I will put an example. So if you have a synonym, let's say that one synonym could be barco, which is masculine. You say el barco, but you could also say nave. It's also a ship, so both mean ship, but it's la nave. So it doesn't mean that the vessel itself, the ship itself, has a gender. The way you refer to has a gender, and you have to follow the rules. If you start talking about la nave, it's a little more poetic, so you have to use feminine to refer to it. If you start talking to el barco, then you have to use masculine adjectives and so on. So that's something that you don't have in English, and I just said something that you don't have in English. And people who try to speak Spanish, they struggle, and it's one of the harder things to learn. What is the gender of certain things? And people make mistakes. As a rule of thumb, you could say, well, if it finishes with a, it's feminine. If it finishes with o, it's masculine. But that does not always apply. Like I say, nave ends with e, so you couldn't tell from that. But to make things worse, there are some things that in English do have gender, but in Spanish they don't. And one of the things I'm thinking about is the possessive pronouns. In Spanish, you have, for instance, to say his or hers, you only have su. When you say su, it applies both to female and male. But in English, you have to use his if you're referring to a male, and her if you're referring to a female. So for us, it's difficult to do that. But to make things even worse, these possessive pronouns, in Spanish, they have number. So you have plural. So if in third person, like I was saying, his and her, if you go to the plural, instead of su, you say, wait. No, the number applies to the thing you're referring to. So if you say his car, you would say su auto. But if he has more than a car, he say his cars. Now you say sus autos, right? So you have to add an S because you're referring to something that is plural after that. So it's kind of the opposite of having number but not having gender. And what is the problem with that? Well, I'll put an example that I always struggle with. So let's say that we're talking about husband, right? Husband is masculine. So if I want to say that is the husband of a certain woman, I would say, in Spanish, I would say su esposo. Since su doesn't have a gender, I mean, I would say su esposo or su esposa to say wife, right? But in English, I have to say her husband. And that creates a huge problem in my brain because her is feminine in my mind and husband is masculine. And I'm not ready to deal with that. So again, if I'm speaking fast and I'm not, concentrated too much, I would end up saying his husband, to say her husband, right? Or her wife. And I'm not talking about these new theories about families or anything. I'm talking about the traditional husband and wife. But it's something that every time my brain stresses out every time because it's not ready to say, oh, I'm jumping from feminine to masculine in the same, 2 words apart. And that doesn't happen in Spanish. The other thing is the letter S. S, both in English and Spanish, usually is used for plural. But English has a lot of outliers. So you have child and you don't have childs. You have children. You have man and you don't have mans. You have men. But in general, you have car, cars. The plural is the S. But when we're talking about some conjugations, that S creates, again, a short circuit in the Spanish speaking brain. And let's say, for example, when you say in English, you love, in Spanish is tú amas, right? And you say, he loves is él ama. Now, I want to point out something, is that in you love, you don't have an S, but tú amas has an S at the end. And it's exactly the opposite when I say he loves, él ama. So where that S is located is the opposite place in English and Spanish. And that is something that I also realize it stresses me while I'm talking, because for me it would make more sense. For my brain, it would make more sense to say you loves, he love. Because that's the way that conjugation works in Spanish. Right? Okay, so we cover the physiological part, we cover about the gender and number part, but there's more issues. And a very, very critical one is the position of the words or how you build the sentences. And this will become relevant at the end. So this is probably the most important one. The previous one are probably just trivia, but this is kind of critical. So in English, you would say something like a big, black, ugly, mean dog, right? So what I want to point out is that until you get to the last word, dog, you don't know what you're talking about. So you're talking about something that is big. At that point, you don't know if it's talking about the universe, a planet, a tree, a problem, a big. You have an attribute and nothing to apply it to. But then you go black. And again, big, black, there's a lot of things that are big and black, right? Then ugly. So all these things are kind of stored in your mind, even if for less than a second, but nonetheless, they're just hanging there waiting for the last word to happen, for you to know what this person is communicating. And this is so important because that's something you need to acquire. In Spanish, it's the opposite. In Spanish, you will say, un perro negro, grande, feo y malo. So the first thing that you say is a dog. Right? And now you can say, you can think about, an Aristotelian or Platonic dog generic dog, an object, and then you start applying attributes to that dog. Well, first you say it's black. Now your dog, that it was a blob, but you know what the dog looks like, a generic dog, a class dog, then you say it's black. Okay, now you say it's big. Then you say it's ugly. And finally you say that it's mean. So in Spanish, the way you would phrase it would be a dog, black, big, ugly, and mean. So it's very different, the thought process to understand that. In the first one, you get all the attributes that you kind of have to store. And in the meanwhile, your brain is kind of figuring out what the heck is this going to be applied to. While in Spanish and other languages, you have the opposite. You have a generic object, and then you start applying attributes. You start modifying that object as you get more information. Why do I say this is critical? Because of what we already talked in the past about the mind. And again, this is mostly my interpretation. I might be wrong. I mean, this is not based on anybody else's work, but maybe a compilation of ideas or things that I read throughout my life. But for me, a mind is a multidimensional network of concepts that we believe in our brains. Topic for another discussion, where the mind lives. But let's say that it's in our brains. So you have all these concepts that are somehow connected one to another. And but it's multidimensional, so everything is connected to pretty much everything. So you have regions that are connected together. And when you learn, what you do is you create new connections, or you strengthen old connections, or you weaken them, or you cut them completely. So that is the process of learning, just modifying your network of concepts in your mind. Now, what is the problem with that? The problem with that is that we cannot communicate in multiple dimensions. Well, we do, but that's for a religious discussion. And if you're interested in that topic, I would encourage you to buy my book and read about that. But for now, let's say that at least in human communications, we cannot send multidimensional concept to another person. So the way we can communicate, affect our minds is through language. But language is a limitation. When you are talking, what you're doing is you're navigating those concepts and putting them in a certain order, and then you create sounds, with that, and the other person takes those sounds, and they decode that and they rearrange in their own mind. So the language is a limitation. So you go for many dimensions to one dimension, because language is linear, right? And then back to many dimensions. So that's why we have so many problems communicating, because what you say is not necessarily what the other person receives, because their mind could be different. But that's a very kind of important part to understand, that language is the way we can interface with our minds. Now, if our languages are different, well, that means that our interaction with our brains will be different. So, in one of the other videos, and we're going to be talking about this later, but so LLMs, so large language models. The great breakthrough of that technology was when researchers stopped trying to model language, and I don't know how purposefully or not. If they did it on purpose, they are extremely genius. If they did it by chance, they're extremely lucky. They started representing the mind. So an LLM is a mind, just interconnected concepts. And what these algorithms do is they just navigate that and start sending words, right, in a certain way that makes sense and sounds like language. So it's not, in the past, what they tried was to model language, itself, and that would never work, right? The phrase would get lost in the middle of the sentences, so it was a mess. They use recurrent neural networks and things like that, and yeah, that was a dead end. But with this, the self-attention in particular, and all this idea of everything is connected to everything, kind of a huge multidimensional matrix, and then you just navigate it and extract language. And the other way around, when you send a prompt, basically you're sending some sequence of words, and then that is processed into that mind, the LLM. So, but going back to what I was saying before, our minds are built by language. That's the way how we connect the concepts. And again, if it's in English, you will connect it differently. Just an example that I said, the way you have to hang, words there, have a placeholder waiting for what is. And I think that in German they say, I don't speak German, I studied a little, but they always say that you need to listen to the last word of a phrase to understand everything before. So I assume that is the case. So that's probably why people from Germany are so different than people, from Argentina or other places. And obviously this applies to a lot of other countries. Like I say, I studied Mandarin, and Mandarin had an issue with tenses. It's very limited. Spanish is extremely rich in all the tenses that you could have, and that kind of gives your mind more freedom to explore, to become more creative how you want to say things. In Mandarin, well, you don't have that. So creativity comes through other processes. So that's why our brains are different, our minds are different, and there's nothing we can do about it. And we can come up with a neutral way to communicate that everybody's uncomfortable with. And they did this experiment, the big push after World War II with United Nations and everything. Well, at first the international language was French, and then kind of shifted to English. In science was Latin, and in engineering was German for many years. But they came up with the idea, let's create a neutral language, and it's Esperanto, and it's kind of a mixture of all the languages, which was not really true. It was a mixture of Western languages. It didn't include anything from India, from Aboriginal languages, from Chinese or Oriental languages. It was just a mixture of. So they could just have used a mixture of Latin and Greek and probably come to the same result. Obviously, it didn't work because that's not how things work in that sense. But it's a failure. I think that they're still trying to push it somewhere, but Esperanto is not the universal language that will overcome all the limitations of language. But please remember this, that our minds are shaped by the language that we speak. And for me, when I speak in English, I cannot translate to Spanish. So it's kind of, I have two different minds. And I have to shift completely from one to the other. They share the same memories and the same ideals and everything, but they cannot easily communicate. I cannot translate easily from English to Spanish. And I don't know, people who have that ability, how they do it, I don't know, but for me it's extremely difficult. Sometimes I'm speaking Spanish with somebody, and then I shift to talk to somebody that doesn't speak Spanish, and I keep speaking in Spanish with them until I see their face of surprise, and then I realize, okay, change my mind to the English one. How can we then learn a language? Well, like I said, you can only learn one language. That is your mother language. I think there's some examples of people who didn't learn a language because they were abandoned in the woods and they grew up with the wolves or whatever. And it was extremely difficult for them to learn a language afterwards. So it's critical that early stage of life when you start learning the language. And historically we try to learn languages by basically trying to learn vocabulary and then grammar. And it doesn't work that way, because language is not about rules. It's not about the words that yeah, those could become handy at some point, but it's not. So I see people who sit down with books or take courses, and they try to learn the language by studying the rules and the grammar and get a vocabulary, and it doesn't work, because the way we learn a language is by immersion. And think about a baby. The process, the babies don't know anything about vocabulary. They don't know anything about grammar, but they start speaking. They, at 2 or 3 or 4, they speak better than me now in English, right? But for learning that way, it's a very Pavlovian process. By Pavlovian, I'm talking about the dog. So you get a stimulus, and then you get a response from that stimulus. And basically the way it works is you hear some sounds, or you're in a certain situation, and your brain start having a stock of potential things to say. So what you do, you say, okay, what is the appropriate thing to say here? So babies are usually just making random noises until one of the more natural, because it's more relaxed, is to say ma, ma, ma. So all the languages, mother, ma in Chinese, madre or mama in Spanish, so mère or what's matter? Yeah, in French. So all have that same sound, because usually the baby's with the mother, and the mother, when she hears the baby calling her, it gives some good feedback to the baby. So the baby starts saying, okay, when I want something, I should say ma, right? And that's a magic word. The second one is, pa, or ba in Chinese, or father, pop, padre, papa, papa. So all have that other simple sound that babies probably do at random, but then when they learn to connect these to the other. And surprisingly, that goes at a very high level. Most of the things that you're saying, you're not thinking. You just have the answer stored somewhere, and you just say, this is the appropriate thing to say, and you should say it. And that's how probably, 90% of the communication happens if we're not thinking about it. We're just reacting to a stimuli and giving pre-stored responses. In that sense, we're not that different than parrots. So parrots do the exact same thing. They just learn some sounds, and when it's appropriate, they just emit those sounds, and they get the reward, and that reinforces them to keep doing that. But we're not parrots. So what is the difference? Well, the difference is what I will call that we have what I would call a modifier. So once you go to the shelf in your mind and retrieve the pre-stored answer, you would look at that answer and you would modify it. You would make it more interesting, you would change some things, then you can start learning about the grammar. Is this the correct way to say it? How can I say it in another way? You can become more poetic, more direct, more. So you modify that pre-stored, response, and then you emit that. So that is where the intelligence lies. It's in the modifiers, and it's my invention. When I was younger, I tried to learn to read Noam Chomsky and other linguists, and I really didn't understand much of what they were saying. But this is my own interpretation of how language works, and I think it makes sense. If it doesn't, just let me know. But those modifiers is what makes us intelligent, right? So not just reacting and saying pre-store things based on stimuli responses. Now let's go back to LLMs. People are afraid of LLMs. Oh, artificial intelligence is taking my job or whatever. LLMs are, like I explained, just glorified parrots. So they can create, extract those responses based on the stimuli, but they're not modifying it. They don't have an intelligence to modify it. You might say, well, but when I talk to ChatGPT, it doesn't always give me the exact same response. Yeah, but that's because of randomization. It's not because of a high-level intelligent evaluation of what you're going to say and modify it. And from modifying, you could even say, I'm not going to say this. Right? Because, this is what my brain, my mind wants to say, but this is not appropriate. And that could happen. So if you don't have that high level thing, that's why children, usually say things that they don't filter. But if you want to live in society, and like we're talking about our rational and irrational mind in our previous video, but it's that's an interesting thing. So LLMs are not intelligent; they are just glorified parrots. So if they will be taking your job, it's probably because your job is not intelligent. You're not adding any high levels to anything, so you could be replaced. I hope you don't feel threatened. I don't think that anybody who would be threatened by AI would have reached this point in this video, because you put a lot of effort trying to follow and understand what I'm saying. So that I would assume that you are someone interested in learning and developing your skills. But don't worry about AI. Could that change in the future? Maybe. We already talked about the singularity and things like that, but it's not trivial at all. AI is still missing the I part, right? It's not really intelligent. It's a parrot that has learned millions of answers, and it's become very smart and very fast at choosing something. So it's definitely a great breakthrough. At some point, if you guys want, I can talk about why I believe superintelligence will never happen the path we are going. It has to do with that, with the incapacity of learning. So AIs are trained. Trained is different than taught. Right, so let's leave it there for now. So, okay. I'm running out of modifiers in English, and so I will just leave it here. I hope you enjoy this, you learned something, or you made you think differently about something. Please, share in the comments. If you agree, if you disagree, if you see it differently, if you speak another language that is not English or Spanish. I also studied Hebrew for the last 5 years, and a lot of things I've seen apply, so I would say Hebrew is way more similar to Spanish than to English, so it was difficult for me because I was trying to study from English to Hebrew, and I really would think it would have been easier to learn from Spanish to Hebrew. But, the tools that we have are whatever. But, well, that will be all for this one. I hope you liked it. You can formally like it by clicking the button. You can always subscribe if you want. But, yeah, so see you in the next one. Bye.